So yeah, if we're making a Sinatra app, there's a lot of things we need to touch, right? And this is like just a time-lapse video of somebody going through and manually typing up a whole bunch of Sinatra RESTful CRUD around this domain of students, right? And they've so far just got like an index and a new and a show up, and they're building some stuff here in the index and setting up some things so that it looks nice. But yeah, what I'm trying to underscore here is that this is a lot of typing, right? It's a lot of explicit configuring. You see us in the config settings. We're talking about specific URLs. It's a lot. I don't think we want to spend that much time on typing. I think we'd rather spend time on solving problems and then finding tools that can do the stuff that we've been typing over and over and like kind of fit the patterns for us. So hopefully at this point in the week, most of you are at a point with Sinatra that there's certain things that are becoming muscle memory, and there's certain things that are becoming maybe a little tedious. Like if you have to write a form and you have to like label your inputs and like name the input every time, there's a lot of syntax, a lot of like opening and closing brackets, and you got to remember when you're embedding your Ruby, right? And maybe it stops being so much about like, I'm excited to try using this form for the first time, and then also stops being so much, I'm still a little nervous about some things about submitting this form, to the point that like you've submitted a certain form like 6 or 7 times and you're like, okay, now my real bugaboo is that I have to keep on writing the same inputs and the same stuff over and over and over again, and I wish that there was less syntax that I had to wrangle, because my brain is no longer interested in the syntax. It just wants to get through the syntax and solve that problem and move on to like the next higher level problem, right? What is this form for? Who's going to interact with it? How do I give feedback to a user, right? What do I do when a form is submitted incorrectly? Do I keep stuff in the form so the user doesn't have to like refill in everything? Do I have animations or alerts that pop up to guide somebody to fill in the form correctly? These are the kind of questions that you're actually going to be talking about with a software team when you're trying to solve problems for a client. We're not going to talk about questions like, is it going to be a text field or a text area, right? Or like, is there going to be one field per attribute on the like that's really like kind of simple or low level stuff. So to try to elevate ourselves beyond just kind of being syntax typers and to be more people who are using a gem to build applications more explicitly, we're going to move on and be off to the races with Rails. This is a man named Daniel Heinemer Henson. He is the CEO of a company called 37 Signals, which was formerly 37 Signals. Now it's just Basecamp. Basecamp is where everybody wants to work, like in tech. Custodial staff there, I think, is making like $67K a year right now. They work like 35 hours a week in the summer because it's summer, so you shouldn't work as much. The like wait list to like try to get an interview there is usually like several hundred deep, because people, when they start on the team, they stay on the team. They just take extraordinarily good care of their employees, and they've created a culture that stamps out burnout kind of entirely. So you have a lot of, I think the average employee there has been there for like 6 or 7 years, right? And this guy is like also a race car driver, because like he has hobbies that he'd rather do than like just be coding all day. And so a lot of his life was like built around this idea that like code would help him to get money, but not define his career, maybe, that he wants to define his life based on like what it allows him to do outside of work. And so I think he brings that kind of mentality to how he codes. So like when they had this company called Basecamp, which is like a way for, it's kind of like before Slack, right? A more professional kind of Slack situation where companies can send really big files back and forth to like vendors or clients that they're working with, and they can portion their work off in like different workspaces. So you can see similarities to other tools you might have used. What set Basecamp apart was like their ability to iterate and respond to user feedback and build like sturdy features that were nice. And they show like over time, they started with like 45 customers when they first opened, and then like 89K in a couple of years, and then 340K. And now they're at this point in like 2020 of having like 3.3 million accounts signed up. I don't think anybody at Basecamp is trying to like have 100 million customers. They like kind of like the grind that they're on and the groove that they're in right now. Part of what helped them do their work so well was they had this like internal tool for web development, right? Somebody had created enough stuff that was working well, right? DHH is like, hey, I've got a lot of features that are helpful. I've got a way that if you give me the name of a resource, I've written a little Ruby method that can create like a URL path for it, right? So if you say cats _ index, then I'm going to give you /cats. That's helpful. I can reuse that, right? And if you give me any name and like say _ index, I can give you like a URL for that, right? So if you said like, oh, dogs new, right? or new dog, right? That might give me the URL /dogs/new. So somebody's written a lot of those helpers, right? And then somebody else has written like, oh, I've got some stuff that's gonna help me figure out how routing works on like a more high level thing. And I've got that hooked up with a rake task that can like quickly print to the terminal all of the routes so that we can have an idea of what our controllers do that's easy to get in at a glance, similar to the way that like a schema.rb file is easy to get a glance at a database. So all of these tools that were like helping Basecamp like do what they needed to do for work, and eventually they said, oh, let's open source this stuff. Like let's wrap it all up into Gem, let's call it Rails. This is the way that we do web app development internally. We have a lot of mature opinions about what helps us because we have thousands of hours of experience working in this code, so it's already like kind of fleshed out and knows how to do some stuff out of the box that's really helpful for people, and that's what we call Rails now, right? So today, going back to this slide, our objectives, we're gonna make a new Rails app, and we're gonna talk about how we've done stuff in Sinatra and how it prepares us to do stuff in Rails, because Rails is going to do things a little bit differently, particularly in routing. That's the first big difference we're going to see. Most of the routes that we've been writing by hand, we're now going to let Rails write for us, and so we're going to do some comparisons of similarities and differences. We're going to create some routes on our own. We're going to create controllers that will serve things at those routes. We'll create models so that there's data in the database to actually serve, and then we'll create some actions and methods for a RESTful controller, and finally we'll get into some ERBs and talk about some of those helper methods in the Rails views that are super nice. This will be a pretty kind of fast-paced, like buzz through a lot of different things, and my goal is to show you like some of the potential of things that Rails can do so that you get a little excited and curious about it going into the weekend, because there's a bunch of labs that are going to kind of rehash some of the things I'll show you slower and in more detail and with more information and more invitation for you to like type it out yourself and practice. So this weekend's gonna be pretty big in terms of moving from Sinatra into Rails and getting used to doing what we've already been doing, but slower at first because we have to learn a new syntax and some new habits around doing it, but then hopefully much quicker in aggregate, because as we trust Rails more and more and trust the conventions that Rails lays out for us, we're gonna have a great time. One last word about conventions. This is something that DHH wrote way back in like 2012. And basically compares like his app to a restaurant and says, I've got Rails, and Rails is like a sushi shop where you go in and like the chefs know what food you need because they've run this successful sushi shop for a long time. And they trust that their palate as chefs is more mature than that of the typical diner. And therefore you might not like unagi. They don't care, it's on the menu. Your own personal opinion about unagi does not outweigh the collective opinion of dozens of people who have put in thousands of hours cooking that particular dish with unagi, so to speak, right? So Rails has decided active record's the way to go, right? In terms of like relating objects in Ruby to a database, Rails says active record's how we're gonna do it. And furthermore, Rails has all this other active stuff. Oh, so you wanna do like, you wanna send emails? We have this thing called like Action Mailer. You want to do uploads of photos? We have something called Active Storage. You want to do background tasks that run on a timer? We have something called Active Job. Somebody goes, but I found this JavaScript library in Node that works really well for jobs. And they're like, that's fine. It sounds like you might want to write that code. But if you'd like to write the Rails way, then we suggest that you try this thing. Rails does make it pretty easy to like hot swap out different like dependencies for things like testing or what kind of database you want to use. But for the most part, you're locked into a set of conventions in Rails, because Rails is a convention over configuration framework, right? It's made to make it harder and lengthier for you to try to go outside of the convention than to just stick with the convention. Down to the point of if I wanted to start writing routes by hand in Rails the way that we've been doing in Sinatra, it's literally going to take me longer to write a route by hand than it will take for me to say, Rails, do your thing, right? And that's a very good thing, because if we're following a REST convention, how often am I going to want to break that convention? Things like routing really hew to that. Other decisions make Rails less popular for some coders, right? People are like, I really don't like the way that they handle emailing, and I wish that they would change it. And DHH is like, no, I'm good. We're solid. You can like this or change restaurants. That's kind of like the attitude of Rails. Very, very highly convention-based. So that means our task as developers is that we're walking onto a playing field and we're playing a new game with rules that we might not know, right? And with strategies that we might not yet appreciate. And so it behooves us as juniors to stay humble and keep our head on a swivel and get as much context as we can about the state of things in this new realm. For help with that, I'd refer you to guides.rubyonrails.org. which is the Ruby on Rails documentation, which is, if you go to this getting started piece here, this whole section is, I don't want to like assign a bunch of reading homework over the weekend, but honestly, if you had like an hour to peruse through something like this, it might be very, very useful for you because it's written to be read top to bottom, like chapter by chapter. It's written explicitly for people who have not touched Rails before, but who do have experience with Ruby. Hey, that's us, right? You are ready to consume this documentation right now, today. And I hope that you believe me because you're going to need to get through some of these labs this weekend, most likely, right? This is the horse's mouth. Straight from this comes all the best information about how to do stuff in Rails. If you care about like other versions of Rails, there's other links to guides, right? Or links to other versions of guides. In here, in Getting Started with Rails, it'll walk you through like what Rails is. They even talk about how opinionated Rails is. It makes assumptions that there is a best way to do things, and it's designed to encourage that way, and in some cases, to discourage alternatives. I also had highlighted something down the page here at one point, which was like, I don't know, it's the word door. There it is. If most things on the menu disgust you, what are you still doing at the table? The door is over there. Try not to slam it on your way out, right? So like we get into the guide here, and it basically says, in Rails, we don't want to repeat ourselves, right? So if there's one way to say something and have it work for all the ways, then let's do that. And then that convention over configuration thing. So then, and then right away, it talks about how to create a new Rails project. So rather than like just reading this to you, because I expect you to read it to yourself over the course of the next few days, let's hop in and let's start making some Rails stuff. Right now, I'm in our folder of code, and there's a command we can use called Rails new, kind of like Cornel new. I guess first, if I didn't have Rails, I'd have to say like gem install Rails, but I have Rails. So I'm gonna say Rails new, and then I like name the application that I'm trying to create. I wanna make this about desserts. Let's call this Deserted. That's good. That's a good name. So look what happened. Just like when we call Cornel new, right? We get a bunch of files created, and we were going to recognize some of these, right? Rake file, config.ru, that looks kind of familiar. We got a README included. Oh, interesting, we've got a gitignore. That's a file where you can like specify subfiles and subfolders in your project that you don't want Git to even see. So like if you had a file that you wanted to put like your Amazon bucket keys in, you wouldn't want to upload that to GitHub because then any hacker can steal your Amazon bucket credentials, right? So maybe you put those keys in the file, you reference that file in your project, and you use a gitignore to hide it. Gem file's still there. We still have an app folder. That's nice. We still have a config folder. We still have a DB folder. They still do the same stuff, right? Apps still gonna hold our MVC, right? We have a controllers folder, we have models, we have views. There's a bunch of other stuff, but as we know from experience, probably about 85% of our work is happening inside of the apps folder at any given time. I think in Rails, a little more of our work is gonna start happening in the config folder, particularly in this file, which is going to do some of the work that our Sinatra controllers used to do. And then finally, DB does the same stuff that it did before, right? It'll have a seeds file in there. When we start migrating, we'll have a migrate subfolder, and then within that, we'll have migration files. So this structure should feel kind of familiar. That's because Cornel was put together by a Flatiron School student, right? Somebody who wanted to prepare Sinatra in a way that would like prepare you for Rails. And also the people who have prepared our labs. Our curriculum writers have made our Sinatra code look a lot like a Rails app on purpose because once again, convention over configuration, right? They might have had a particular opinion about how few files you could actually have in a Sinatra app, but why not just start teaching the Rails convention a little bit earlier so we can just start transferring our awareness of where we are in an app directly from our Sinatra work into our Rails work. So a bunch of files got generated, and also, look what else happened. It just like ran a bundle with Rails new, like right out the gate. Just like boom, 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 we're doing a bundle install. Okay, and then what else happened? Got some kind of error, I don't know. Optional dependency. Well, if it's optional, I don't care too much. I think we'll be okay. Because we still did stuff afterwards. It saved a lock file. There's like a gemfile.lock that gets created every time you run a bundle install, and that just sets our versions of our gems to make sure that like the ones that we have installed, if we shared this project with another team, the gems are going to reinstall on their computer based not on the gem file, but on like exact versions in the lock file, which is kind of nice. And then yeah, all of these different dependencies have come down. So yeah, that's what a Rails new does. A bunch of things, right? Let us hop in. just going to do a quick ls here. Most of this should look familiar, right? Like, once again, if we look at the like folders and files and stuff, and let's actually open up the project, there's one thing in here I don't really care for, which is the .git directory. I've opened a new Git repository as part of Rails New. So Rails New assumes that every new Rails application is going to be a Git project, right? Problem is, we're already in a Git repo, right? I'm in your cohort's code repo right now, so I don't want to create a sub repo. So what I'm going to do is just get rid of this Git folder, which basically eliminates all of the Git history. I could even say, check this out, git log. Doesn't have any. If I say git status, it knows about all these files that just got added, right? So we do have Git happening. If I say rm-rf.git,
what's the RF thing?
RF is when you're removing a folder, you need to do like a recursive, like go through subfolders, like recurse through other folders. Yeah, go down into that folder, and any folders and files inside go into those, and any folders and files inside go into those, and just get rid of it all. So yeah, now if I say git status, let's see, unbranched master, let's see, what else do we have? ls-a. Might be because I have the git ignore here. I was wondering, in any case, I don't necessarily want to have a sub repo thing, so I might do a little bit more scrubbing of this code before I like upload it. But yeah, let's actually hop in. Yeah.
If you like fork and clone a lab, for instance, instead of doing Rails New, you won't have to get rid of that Git.
That's right. Yeah, that repo you'll want to like follow. This is like me starting an app from scratch and thinking about the place that I'm in. So yeah, in terms of Rails, we're in this project now, and I've got access to all this stuff: app, config, db. We've also got like this bin folder. We've got lib. We've got log, public, storage, test. Various jobs for various folders. We're not going to belabor them too much right now, because later on in labs and readings and stuff, the ones that you need to use will be like more opened to you and explained like piece by piece. So I want to keep it to the stuff that looks very familiar to Sinatra and just talk about similarities and differences. Going back to our goals here. I don't need to CDHH that much. Cool. We made a new Rails app, right? Let's talk about differences between Sinatra routing and Rails routing, right? Sinatra route has some ingredients. Somebody give me one ingredient of a Sinatra route, like in a controller. Yeah, we have a verb, right? We have get, and then what's after that? Yeah, so we have different verbs we could use. We have get, post, and like after that verb we have like a string that's usually going to start with like a slash because we're talking about a URL path, right? And then we open and we have a block, right? Then there's a do and an end, and then some stuff happens inside of the block. So we could say that in a Sinatra controller, we define the HTTP verb, and we define the URL, and we define what's to be done in that route, right? All at once. In Rails, it's a little different. In Rails, in your controller, you're not going to have a block. You're going to have a method now. And that method's going to have a name like index, new, show, create, edit, update, delete, one of the 7, right? And where do those 7 names get keyed in? There's another file now called config routes.rb. And I've lost my atom. We'll hop back in here to config routes.rb. This file gives us a block, rails.application.routes.drawDo. And the nice thing about Rails New is that they are constantly encouraging you in these comments to go back and check out the guide for information on how to route things. So if I'm going to make an app about desserts, I'd like a dessert to maybe have like a name and maybe like a deliciousness integer, and maybe that's it. But I need to have like a place that I can list all of my desserts, right? There needs to be an index route. I need to have a place that I can show one dessert, so a show. There needs to be a form for creating a new dessert, a new, right? So this Rails routing from the outside in chapter of the Rails guides walks us through what the Rails router does. The Rails router, we could put in a line like this. Let's repurpose this. So I'm going to say, like, let's draw a route like this. Get, I'm not going to say patience, though, because we're talking about desserts, right? So here's a dessert show route. We can say here, get desserts ID, and then we have this to, because we've separated now the verb URL from the work to be done. We've defined the verb in URL here, just like if we were starting a Sinatra controller route. But then here, this routing station is pointing that URL and method pattern to a specific controller and to a specific method in this controller. Such that if I had a controller called a desserts controller in this controllers folder, and I had a method called def show inside of there, that method is going to start running whenever somebody hits this URL pattern with a GET request. So that's kind of weird, right? Because I've got this file where I'm declaring what all my routes are and what methods should run, but then I've got a whole other set of files where I've got the methods actually defined. So how am I supposed to keep track of all of that? It almost feels like I need to have like 2 tabs in my code editor open at the same time. I have a rake task for this.
Can you explain that desserts and show again?
Yeah, so the idea here, this is going to live in a controller. We're going to be in a controller called the desserts controller, and then there's going to be a method called the show method, and it's going to be an instance method because we have the hashtag symbol. Similar to what we saw in module 1 when we had like user stories about what kind of methods we needed to write and whether they'd be instance or class methods. We're looking for an instance method show inside of a controller named desserts here. Here's another way I can tell though, because I don't want to just have to think about it. And Rails gives me a tool that I use probably once every 15 to 20 minutes whenever I'm coding in a Rails app, just to make sure I have my bearings. And that tool is rake routes, which serves us thusly. And there's a lot of routes here. And a lot of these routes I don't actually particularly care about just yet. I'm going to make this a little smaller so it's easy to see these like line by line, because some of these route names are extremely long. I've got a lot of routes around mailing and conducting and storage that I don't actually care about right now, but that Rails gives me by default. Once again, omakase. Rails is like, I've already created the routes for this other stuff that a lot of people do in apps. So the active storage stuff is about like file uploads, and then the mailbox, I'm assuming, is about sending and receiving messages. These are routes that if I don't want them used, I have to add a new flag. Like I have to call Rails new, and then I have to say like -- skip - active - storage if I want to take out these routes down here. And I bet you that there's like a skip conductor and a skip action mailbox thing too, but that's fine. What I want to talk about is this first line. Above all the noise, here's the thing that we wrote, right? Get to desserts ID, right? That's our verb, that's our URI pattern. And then we could also add, optionally, we could say like .exe or .html if we wanted a specific kind of file at that route, but we'll just talk about desserts ID for now. If it's in parentheses, you don't really need to worry about it for these routes. Not today. And then we have this controller in action, desserts controller and show action. So I can use routes to see all of the routes that I've got, right? The nice thing about Rails is, remember when I said that like it would actually be longer to write a whole route? Check this out. Maybe like I'm going to have a many-to-many between desserts and restaurants. So I say resources restaurants and watch what happens. Oh, this is nice. There's our 7, technically 8 because put and patch are sharing real estate, but there's our 7 RESTful actions and routes for all of them, and they're conventionally named, right? We have these prefixes, which I'll get to in a little bit, but we still have these like verb URI patterns, so like post restaurants, right? What kind of action is that? If I go to post restaurants, what am I doing? Yeah, I'm creating a restaurant. So if I extend this over, right? Yep, sure enough, that's restaurants create. It knows. It knows like what the 7 things are. And I can even give it options. Like if I don't want to be able to delete a restaurant, I could even say like except, and then I could like say delete. Run this again. So this like syntax, right, that we have inside of this config route is pretty powerful. Ooh, did I miss one? Oh yeah, it's not delete. Sorry, the word is destroy. Let's run it again. I shouldn't have that delete anymore, right? We have our patch put, we have our post, and we have our gets, but we no longer have a restaurant's destroy action because I said accept, right? I could even pass accept an array and have multiple things. Say accept destroy, edit, update. And that'll just leave those 3 out. So in this way, we can very quickly like set up a conventional routing infrastructure for a given resource that follows the REST convention, right? Convention over configuration. Why would I need to name my restaurant routes anything different right now than like what the convention is? So that's what Rails gives me, is a very, very quick syntax, resources, and then the keywords except. The opposite of except is only. So if I flipped the polarity here, I expect to only see edit, update, and delete under restaurants. Sure enough, there we've got it, right? So like, this is going to be my reference for knowing what am I allowed to do in my app, what URLs am I allowed to travel to as a user of the app, right? If I try to go to a given resource in the browser and the app yells at me and says like, I don't know, there's no route for that, then I can run rake routes, or alternately, I can run Rails routes. They're synonymous. Either one works. And when I run Rails routes or rake routes, I'm gonna get access to like, oh yeah, maybe I couldn't get to restaurants index because I don't have a route for restaurants index, right? If you do have a route but you haven't written a controller action, Rails is gonna spit at you for that too. Let's make some dessert stuff, right? Let's get something into a database so we can actually start displaying things. Yeah, that's good for routing. So we have to create a migration, and we have to create a model. I don't even have a migrate folder. I'm curious about this. Let's see. If I do rake-t again, like I used to do in Sinatra, will that still be useful for me? Let me make this a little bit larger font again. It's formatted a little weird. That's a little better. Cool. So I still have a lot of these same things. Some of these are now going to be about Rails type stuff, like asset compilation. This implies like I have a production app and I'm trying to optimize like how my pictures and CSS files are getting cached and served and stuff. I'm not really concerned with that. But look, the old friends are back. Create, drop, migrate. Let's see. Well, what about, I don't know. I don't see anything about create migration anymore. Right? We used to have rakedb create migration in Sinatra. We don't really have that anymore. What we have now in Rails are called generators. So the keyword generator is something you should be looking for if you want to have a way to quickly make something in the terminal. So if I want to generate a migration for desserts, I could say Rails generate migration, create desserts. Beep, beep, beep. Cool. And it created a timestamped migration in the db migrate folder, which it also made for us, called create desserts. So we should be on familiar home turf now. This is the nice thing. Under the hood of Rails, we still have active record. Active record's the same, right? This is a version of Rails that is going to append a version number for active record migration that we inherit from. If you see that convention being followed in your version of Rails, don't touch that stuff, like let it be there, because if it's not there, it's probably gonna break how your migrations run. But check this out, it even filled in create table desserts, because my naming of the file was so conventional, right? Create underscore desserts, Rails assumes, oh, so the thing you want to run inside your change method is a create table command, right? And you want to say create table desserts, otherwise why would you name the file like that, right? And maybe I have my own personal naming convention, like that I'm now violating. I didn't expect to create a table desserts. And Rails would simply say, well, learn the naming convention that we use, or try to different framework. I don't know what you want to do. Like maybe you could email HTML documents to your friends and like just wait for them to respond with a new link. And we got a way to build an app. Find our way. Do it. So yeah. Anyways, by following the naming convention, I'm able to get create table filled in for me. Let's say that a dessert has a t.string, which is a name. T.boolean. Sorry, I still need a symbol here, which is going to be like gluttony, and then we'll have t.integer, which will be tastiness. Cool. So this is like a desserts migration. This is pretty boilerplate. I'm going to add timestamps too, because it's time we grow up and use the timestamps. And now I'm going to say Rails, or I'll say rakedb migrate. Beep, beep, beep. Cool. We migrated. We're good. We got something in the database. And now I can say Rails console, or C for short. And so now I'm in a Rails console. So I can say like dessert.all. Uninitialized constant dessert. Oh yeah, I forgot to create a model. So as we've done, we go into the models folder and we'll create a new, you know what, how about this? Rails G model dessert. Boom, Rails. Oh no, active record conflict. Another migration is already named create desserts. Use force to replace this migration. Okay, so if I say G model, Rails assumes that I want a migration to go with that model, because that's what a model is, an MVC. So right now it's throwing an error at me because it's like, you already made this migration, like it's already called create desserts. I'm assuming that's the one for this dessert thing you're talking about creating a model for. Do you want us to like overwrite that file and like just give you a fresh one, or do you have stuff in there you want to keep? I have stuff in here I want to keep. So what should I use? What should I say according to the output? Skip. Skip. Look at that. We created a model and we created test files for a dessert, right? There's another flag if you want to skip test file creation. I'll leave that up to Googling and stuff. For now, I feel like I'm off to the races. We have a model called dessert. It already inherits from application record. Well, what the heck is that? Application record is a top level class that exists to hold like app-wide config settings, things that all of your models should share, or configuration settings that all of your models will share by default in Rails. Similar to how application controller in Sinatra held your like config stuff, and then if all your other controllers inherited from application controller, you wouldn't have to copy paste that config info in. Same exact concept, just in the model space. So it still inherits from active record base. There's no magic there, right? Same exact active record under the hood. We just add one layer of abstraction because the Rails designers decided by convention that it's good for them to give us out of the box a place to change all of our model settings at once if there's something that covers all of them. But in our dessert class, that should be enough for us to call dessert.all. So let's see, Rails C, dessert.all. There are none. That makes sense. We didn't seed anything. So if we look at dessert, it's got an ID, it's got a name, it's got gluttony, it's got tastiness, and it's got created at and updated at. Let's make a new one. Name is, and this one's going to be non-gluten. Somebody give me a tastiness number. 7. Wow, that's okay. I was thinking on a scale of 1 to 50. Cool. So yeah, it's got no ID. Why? Very good. Yeah, so we had moose.save. Great, cool. So we've got a dessert in the database. Let's make one more. Somebody give me a number for tastiness. 10. Wow.
Do we need to redo our records so we can put a cap on what the rating can do?
If I wanted to cap the rating, I could. I'm just putting an integer in there. I just wanted to showcase that like storing things in different values is possible here as anything else we've done. But yeah, I could have validations. I could even have a before save callback that like clamps the value before it hits the database. I have options in Rails. Same options, honestly, as I had in Sinatra, but with more practice. Save, that should save the ice cream. Cool. So we have 2 desserts. That's enough to iterate through. I think that's enough for an index route, right? So we've got that. That's a little review. Let's go back to the new stuff. I want to see both of these desserts that I've put in the database. So what I'd like to do is reconsider the routes that I've created in config routes.rb. Once again, like I said, every 15 minutes or so, I find myself either coming back to this file or checking my rake routes. And as I plan what I want, I think what I'd like to do is not have manually set routes for desserts. I'd rather say something like resources, desserts, only, and maybe we could just work with index and show for now. And then I can always run Rails routes again to see what I've got. And I'm really just looking at the top of the list for those first couple. That's the one I care about the most. And so we have desserts get to /desserts. Cool, and then we have get to /desserts ID for the show route. Cool. So the way I read this is like I start with the verb maybe, and then we go here, and that's one line, right? And then here's another line. So that looks like I've got routes for index and show set up correctly. If I'd like to start a server up, I don't use shotgun. I say Rails server. Or I could say Rails S. Fires up a server. And to get to my server, I need to get to a different port. What's the port I need to go to now? Not 9393, but yeah, just like Andre. Let's do it. Localhost. There it is. Yay, I'm on Rails. We did it. An application is us. We did it. No, this, I probably want to go to that desserts route, right? /desserts. Oh, here's a thing we can do, by the way. We could do this, like a root. Oh, how do we do this? Let's go to this routing from the outside in. It's one of the first things they talk about up here. Let's see, link to generating paths, configuring the router. Where is my root thing? I know that there's a root keyword. And yeah, using root, there it is, end of chapter 3. So yeah, you can say root, and then you can just pass in a controller and an action. So I might want to say like root goes to desserts index, for example. So I could say root desserts index. So then the next time I go to like /, it should just be rerouting me to the route for desserts index, right? Or it should be executing work at desserts index to serve me something at the index. So if I go here and refresh, okay, this is fantastic news, right? Because it means that root thing worked. And now instead of just showing the boilerplate that comes with every new Rails app, we're like, welcome, you've gotten online. Now it's actually trying to go to desserts index, right? But it can't because we don't have a desserts controller yet. Do you think we might have a generator for a controller? I think we might. Yeah, let's try it. Make a new tab so I can keep that running. Rails G controller desserts. Cool. So we created a desserts controller, and it looks like it also created a controller test, and it also created a helper file. We're going to talk about helpers a lot later on, but like a helper is basically methods that don't really belong inside of a model, but are there to assist a controller or views from doing their work, but we don't want to like just put the raw code in the controller or in the view. We still want to break out a method for dryness. Anyways, we've got a desserts controller now. Let's see what it looks like. In this controllers folder, a new controller appears, inheriting from application controller, kind of like what we saw in Sinatra, as I said. And now if I say, well, let's see, if we refresh the page, yeah, now it knows about desserts controller. The action index could not be found for desserts controller. Here's a fun thing. When you see an error screen in Rails, it's got a little sandbox. What do my params look like? Controller, desserts, action, index, permitted, false, right? So like I'm not even at a controller. There's not much I can do here. What if I said like request? Is that a thing? Oh gosh, it is. This is like the whole request object, right? If I say like request.path, it knows where I am. It knows I'm at like the /. So even if I couldn't get to a controller and I wasn't really sure what was in my URL bar for some reason, maybe I have like a broken screen up here, I could still kind of figure out where I got to, like through other means, Sherlock style. Anyways, let's put in an index action in the desserts controller. Like I said, this is going to be a method, def index end. And inside of this controller, I think that what I'd like to do is do like a desserts equals dessert.all, right? Because like we've done that before for indexes, desserts. Cool, and then we'd need to have like, oh look at that, they made a views desserts folder when we generated the controller. How polite. Let's make a new file called index.erb. Because that's the conventional name, right? We're getting kind of used to that, this REST convention stuff. We name the index route index. And then here we have like, desserts? Yeah. Let's try this if we go here. Oh, I forgot to call on the ERB file. Shoot. Oh, it didn't matter. Why? Because I'm in the index route in the desserts controller. What file would I be rendering other than an index.erb out of a desserts subfolder in views? I'm following a convention, which Rails is happy to help me along with, right? Now, if I wanted to call it all desserts, that's a non-restful name. It still describes what's happening, but it's not the convention. So if I named this file all desserts, it's not gonna know where to go. It's gonna yell at me. All desserts, right? Huh, more like just desserts. All right. Yeah, no template. It's saying it's missing a template for request formats, text, HTML. And then look at this. Note, unless told otherwise, Rails expects an action to render a template with the same name, contains in a folder named after its controller. If this controller is an API responding with 204 no content, which does not require a template, etc., right? It just said the thing I said. We get the subfolder, and then we get into the, I was practicing rapping, so I'm going faster. But let's go back. Let's go back to index.erb. That's the sensible name in the sensible place, and Rails is willing and able to help us do the sensible thing with it. That's a beautiful thing, right? What great news. So we have this root thing that's like helping us get somewhere right with the index. We have this like, it's just going and grabbing the ERB. And by convention, a Rails app is built to kind of return an ERB, like via HTML. By the way, not the only thing Rails can do. What's Mod 4 working on? Does anybody know? The stack? Yeah, they're working on React, right? Is React Ruby? Nah, it's JavaScript, right? So what they have is a JavaScript front end, but still needs to talk to a back end to like get information, and then it needs to return JSON for them to have in JavaScript. So they have like a JavaScript hash basically, and it's like nested, and it's got all this stuff, and then they're on their front end doing JavaScript things. Rails, since version 5 or so, has been able to like really easily out of the box be configured as just a back-end API. So kind of what we've done all week is design APIs, right? What is an API? It's a route you go to and you expect a thing to come back. We've been creating APIs for rendering HTML templates, right? In Mod 4, they're using Rails as an API to render JSON objects to their front end so that they can use the front end templating tools that they have to build their UI over there, right? Rails doesn't have to just return completely filled in HTML documents with CSS and JavaScript getting sent from the server. Rails can just send like a hash over, and then whatever it's got on the front end can pick up that hash and run with it. But in any case, we are in the ERB zone. I just wanted to say that because I want to underscore how important this part of this mod is, that like the more familiar you get with Rails now and the more reps you get, later on in Mod 3 when you need to use a Rails backend, it's going to be easier to come back to it. And in Mod 4 when you need to use a Rails backend, easier to come back to it. So even though we'll step away from Ruby in Mod 3 and 4, we'll still keep Rails by our side. And we'll see why. It's a fun friend. Let's build this ERB out. Tag it, right? Desserts.all, or desserts, we already have dessert.all to get desserts. So now we can like iterate through these. I want to talk about other methods real quick. Rails gives us helpers to create text that we normally want to have. So one kind of text that we'd like to have is like, what's a URL, right? And another kind of text that we might like to have is like, what's a common HTML element we're going to use a lot, right? So like if I have an index page for desserts, what I'd like to show is like a link to each dessert. I can like show the dessert name, and that'll be like a link to the dessert show page. So let's draw that out the way that we know how to, and then let's draw it the way that Rails knows how to. So let's say we have like each one is going to be on its own line. So you know I love my p tag. It reminds me of the p statement in Ruby, and that's always how I learn stuff. So like the p tag makes me feel super smart. And then inside of the p tag we'll have an anchor tag. Well, not like that. Suppose we'll just do it the hand way. All right. Cool. So this anchor tag is going to have an href of probably desserts. It has to start with a slash, right? Or else we get that weird relative pathing stuff. So it'll be dessert slash, and then we could say dessert.id. Dessert. And then in here, don't spoil it, Dave. Relax. I know you're excited, but this is dessert.name. Yeah, let's see what this looks like. Chocolate mousse, ice cream, yay! Let's hover over. Yeah, that's desserts 1, that's desserts 2, right? Like those are links. You know what? I'm really excited to see if we can like link to another route in Rails, because it said we had an index route and it said we had a show route. Let's try clicking on this link and then use the same exact errors that we had before to guide us to like making the next resource. So if I click on chocolate mousse, oh no, the action show could not be found for desserts controller, right? It knows it's at the show route. Why? Because Rails routes knows that the URL desserts ID, when we go to it with a GET request, is for the show. show, right? That routes.rb file has handled all of that knowledge for us, and it's using that to figure out what controller action should be called. So in the desserts controller, let's make one. Def show. What about this? Flern. That's fun. I like to make errors happen. Why? Because I get a debug screen. What's params right now? Oh, params ID is 1, right? Because it still said ID in the route pattern, remember when we looked at it? So therefore, like, we have to know how to read Rails routes and know that whatever is filling in after the slash gets called ID. And if I need to be reminded, every 15 minutes or so I'm in here, checking it out. What's going on with the routes? And yeah, since we called this part of the slug ID convention, or this part of the route got the wildcard name ID, that's how over here, ID is now in our params hash, right? And that's just a little bit of review. And it's nice to print out params everywhere you go, and it's nice to print stuff out elsewhere in the app, in the controllers, maybe in your models when they get hit, so you get a feeling of it, because this is one of those places, right, where it's a little different and a little scarier. In Sinatra, we'd see :ID right above the stuff we're about to do in the route, but now, where am I? I'm in this controller file. It's my job to remember the rest convention and to know that conventionally I have access to params ID here. And if I can't remember that from my own memory, it's my job to know how to use Rails routes to figure out what the name of that should be. And if both of those things are failing me, I should be able to go and make a mistake on purpose in a strategic place so that I can get access to the data that I want that way. There's a lot of paths up this mountain. As Kamana said, if you went to the nerdery tour this morning, a big part of success in this mod is going to be figuring out what workflow, what set of processes works for you, and then practicing that process, not just the technology, but your approach to it. And I would also agree that her process is a very sturdy one. She was a very strong student, by the way, because she was consistently breaking things down to very small pieces, taking the time she needed to take on that small unit of work, and then compiling it back into the whole. Sometimes you watch somebody really slow down to understand that one little thing, but you know it's like cleaning a room. I'm not worried about your pace. I see a bunch of piles in your brain, but that's what happens right before everything gets nice and clean, right? So don't be afraid to like really move stuff around. Take a look at something really small. Okay, we got this ID. Now I feel confident that I can go back to my controller and say my dessert will be the one that I find based on my params ID. Cool. I don't need to reference a view. I could, right? I could still say ERB show. Just a little redundant, but I think it should still work. Let's test it. I like that. That's a fun one. Ooh, the period followed by a comma. I'm gonna play with that on Twitter. I think it implies something emotionally about being done. I'm done, but I'm not done with you. Like that kind of thing, maybe? Yeah. So we refresh. Oh, interesting. Undefined method ERB. Well, that's a new one, huh? It's almost like I designed that error. Let's see. What do I say instead? What am I trying to do? Nick, how would you say in human words what I'm trying to do here related to this HTML? Trying to like show it to the user. I'm trying to render it. Thank you. I always forget that word. All right.
That's my human word.
Yeah, render. Let's try render. Render show. Oh, that's better. Cool. So we use render instead of ERB now, right? And we have render and then we have redirect. And that almost reminds me of like the Able sisters from Animal Crossing. Similarly named, they're working together, they're helping us out. So we have render and redirect instead of just like ERB and redirect now. Another fun thing about these methods is that like render, even though we think of it as being the end, it's not the end. Like rendering this show route is not returning out of the method. So if I say here like p banana, we refresh, and then I go back and look at my Rails server, we printed banana. Like we rendered and we also printed banana. So we have to be careful now. If we use the word render multiple times inside of a method, we need to be positive that there's only one possible path to a render within that method. If it's possible for a two renders to happen, then Rails gets mad. So like, let's say that I had something like this. If true, which is, yep, that's gonna happen, we render show. And then at the end, and then we say, otherwise, let's render index again. Then if I tried to do this, Rails is gonna have a problem because rendering did not return. It shows me this double render error. And the issue here is that like I had an if condition that was true, and then it rendered, and then the if condition was done, and then it tried to render again, and Rails is really designed to only render one time. So I would have wanted to say something like this instead, because now, logically, I can only do one of these things in the method. I can never do both. So then we're back on track. That's something I wanted to show to like differentiate between what rendering is in the context of like a Sinatra block, where like the end of the block determines what comes back and then it's over. But rendering is not a hard return in a or in a Rails controller method. So just be mindful of that. We had our show for dessert. I think that we could go over here to our show route, talk to the dessert at dessert.name. This dessert, oh, let's do a fun conditional, just as a review. We could say like if dessert.gluttony, ID, no, id, maybe. Run one of these, right? We could have an if else. We could display stuff based on a condition, right? So like if the dessert is gluttony, we could say something like, oops. I also like the idea of like gluttony, like mutiny. I'm thinking about a pirate bakery scenario in my head. The sketch hasn't fleshed itself out. I'll let you know when it does. Right, something like this. And then if we go back and refresh, yeah, chocolate mousse, dig in, no gluten here. Does that work for desserts too? Sure does. Ice cream, dig in, no gluten here. And then if I made like a third dessert, which I can do, right, with my workflow, the process I love is to keep a shotgun always running so I have a conduit to the browser. Really quick feedback loop into my code. And then I like to have another tab for, you know, stuff I need to do, whatever. It's chill, it's no biggie. I go in here to the console, and I'm like, I want to test the appearance of a gluten-full dessert to make sure my if-else works. So now I say dessert.new. I'm gonna do Nilla wafers because the master teacher in data science was telling me really cool facts about how Nilla wafers were like placed near the produce section in Atlanta, because Atlanta was like a place that a lot of old overripe bananas got dumped, and so a lot of people made banana pudding, and they realized they had like this inroad to like cross-selling Nilla wafers, and so that was one of the first cases of like you're in the pasta aisle but you see Parmesan cheese, or you know you're in the soup aisle but you see crackers, right? You're in the dinner for one aisle and you see like a hotline for ordering tickets to Maury. Cool. So we have gluttony. True. We'll say a tastiness of 8 because it looks like 2 vanilla wafers stacked on top of each other. What? Okay, it's Friday, guys. Relax. All right, create. Sweet. We'll go to desserts 3 now. That's the feedback loop I like, right? I touch the database and then I'm in the browser because I have the other tab open and I can immediately see it live in the app. Anything that you can do that shaves like 60 seconds or even 30 seconds or even 10 seconds off the time between when you have an idea and when you get to see if the idea works, do that thing, like add it to your process, practice that thing, make it part of what you do, and then share it with somebody next to you. So yeah, that works. So dessert show page, let's do some refactoring. I wanna get back to the index, but I don't wanna draw a whole link this time. Okay, let's go back to Rails routes for realsies. Talk about this first column, prefix, right? Who was curious about that prefix column? Anybody? A whole tour this morning imploring you to be curious, and I didn't see a single hand. I'm gonna call Greg. No. So I don't really know Greg like that. But check this out. Prefix is a shorthand for method prefix. So when you create a route in Rails, part of Rails.application.routes.draw part of the process of drawing routes is making accessible to the views in your application and to the controllers in your application a set of methods namespaced based on your route, right? So we have a prefix not of cats, but this route is desserts, right? So we have desserts is the prefix that we use for index. Why? Because we're gonna see a lot of desserts there, right? Dessert to see one dessert, right, for that route. Other times when we fill in more routes, you're gonna see, like for example, if I wanted to talk about showing a dessert, right? Or no, editing a dessert, let's try that. Let me add a couple more in here. Matter of fact, let's just go back to the OGs. Show me the Magnificent Seven. You'll see that prefix doesn't show on every line. Because like get, patch, put, and delete, they're always talking about dessert/ID. That's the same exact URL pattern. The only thing that changes is the HTTP verb. And so everything with a similar URL pattern gets put into the same prefix namespace. So that means that new and edit with distinct URLs get distinct prefixes. And what I want you to imagine is that like after the prefix, there's some kind of suffix, right? That's why it's called a prefix. Here's a suffix that we can use. Underscore path. Underscore URL. Right? Sometimes you can literally just call on the prefix itself and that'll be enough, conventionally speaking. Let me show you what I mean. So we could, in this show page, have like our anchor tag, right? We could have href/desserts. We could say back to index, right? And this should give us a link to go back to the index. Fantastic, that works. That's review. Let's move it forward. Instead of saying href desserts, what if I said desserts path? Oh, it's still purple because it's the same thing. It's just the path for desserts because the prefix desserts, right, mapped with the index route. So if I say desserts path, I'm going to get the desserts path. I think I can even do this. Can I say just desserts? I don't know if I can just say desserts. Let's go back here. No, it didn't like that. Let's run this back. So we had desserts path. What I need to do is get beyond this href. I'm sick and tired. Show of hands, who's a little tired of writing hrefs by hand every single time? Just a little bit, maybe, kind of, sort of. What if we did this? What if we said link to, and we wrapped this up? Because link to is a helper that we get. And link to is going to take two arguments. The first argument is going to be what the user sees. So the first argument is going to fill in the body of an anchor tag. And then the second argument is going to be where the user goes, right? So what I could say here is like link to back to the index, just so that's easy to distinguish. And then I say desserts path here. Back to the index. /desserts/desserts. These links are identical, right? And later on, with a lot more routes and a lot more things to wrangle, you're going to find it's a lot easier to just embed some Ruby and call on a link helper than it is to try to make sure that you didn't forget a front slash or a backslash or a preceding this or a trailing that, or did you forget the colon or whatever else. That means that from the index, we should be able to link back to an individual dessert, right? Like, instead of doing this href stuff, what if we did, I don't know, something like this? Oh no, not that kind of commenting out. I wanted like this one. What did I forget? I've commented this wrong.
Two double arrows, or is it?
I don't think so. Let me see.
No, I mean not double arrows. I mean hyphens. Is it one?
Is it just one? No, it's not one. I never remember.
Back into?
Let me see. I always just have to look. It's not in my brain. Oh yeah, I should probably, like, what kind of comments? Just comments. Hey, you want to talk about comments? I got comments. Oh, the comment tag. How do we use it? Yeah, that looked right. I thought I had that. Bam, bam. Right? Is that going to work? If I go back to the index, is it just not coloring it right? Yeah, it's just not coloring it right. Cool. That's weird. I wish it was coloring it right. But in any case, we could do this. We could say p tag, and then inside of here, we could say link to. Dessert. Well, sometimes in Ruby, you're going to see parentheses used, right? Sometimes people will not use parentheses because part of the magic of Ruby is you don't actually have to. And so mature Rails developers write very idiomatic Ruby where they don't use a lot of parentheses at all. And you might see somebody saying like link to dessert dot name, comma, dessert path. Why? Because the show page, right, was dessert, singular. Like index was desserts path, show page would be dessert path. And then here's a problem. I have a URL generation error, and it's saying it's missing required keys ID. And the reason is that some of these paths you can just say and get a URL, right? If I say desserts path, it gives me /desserts because that's the pattern. What's different between the desserts path pattern and the dessert path pattern? It needs to know which dessert. It needs to know the ID. It's missing the parameter ID. How is it going to get the parameter ID? Well, I can pass it in as a method or as an argument to my dessert path method. So if I say dessert path dessert, that should get me there. Cool. Faster way to say this, by convention, if you just talk about an individual object, Rails assumes that you're talking about a show page for the object. So that's another way we could get around. I don't know about y'all, but I like this syntax a lot. Link to dessert.name, comma dessert. We're gonna link to the dessert. We're gonna show the user to the dessert name. The anchor tag gets generated. And actually, if we take a look like at one of these, I'm sorry, I was trying to right click and failed to do so. I'm still trying to right click. One of these days, there we go. Yeah, it's desserts 1, right? It's the same path that we're used to. Like under the hood, Rails is just following the rules that we've spent this week learning in Sinatra about how paths are typically named. That means that this weekend, as you practice Rails, some of what you're going to be practicing is still going to be like internalizing these REST conventions, because Rails is just piggybacking on all the naming stuff, right? Our folder names, our file names are all based on what kind of model we have, what's the RESTful action, and then we have all these helpers that are based on conventional naming around routes. And yeah, learning how to follow those conventions means learning more how to envision what is happening under the hood, what URL is being generated and why. Like, how does this apply to the REST framework? How does this apply to like what I've been doing before in Sinatra? Where would I be typing this out by hand that now Rails can do it automatically? And a lot of the initial labs are gonna walk you through some of this stuff in a little bit more detail. I think that that's all I really had to show at the moment, so I'm curious about what questions people have.
I think we're missing an opportunity to showcase Rails' biggest benefit, and that's
Oh, yeah.
the titleize
Yeah.
method.
Oh, the titleize method? Oh yeah, Rails does have titleize.
Maybe we can edit the name. This is my favorite thing.
Yeah, and I just found they extended this to active record, I think, because I saw this in Sinatra yesterday. Like, because I was trying to like do the deep slugifying in a really kind of lazy, hacky way, just to see if I could. And it titleize worked there. But yeah, titleize is dope. You know what? There was a dope thing I didn't show you. Let's go back to this video, right? Because like okay, I'm gonna start this video, and I'm gonna see if I can make an app faster. Let's add a feature. I don't know. Rails G scaffold. Maybe taste tester has a name, an age, that's an integer. Boom! Oh, sure. I win.
This is so stressful.
It's my favorite fake name. Ched. What's up? What's up? Name's Ched. So yeah, that's a scaffold. You're not gonna really use scaffold. Why? Because like we got a lot of extra files here. Like we got a lot of extra files. We got some like JSON builder stuff. There's some SCSS, which is like a special kind of like variable enabled CSS that lets you do more programmatic things with your CSS code. There's this like fixtures test stuff that got added in. Yeah, in the past, like you used to get a lot of like coffee script files, which is like a special flavor of JavaScript. Obviously, like we're not going to code by generating scaffolds this weekend because that's not actually coding in Rails. And somebody can spot when somebody has scaffolded an app from a mile away in this industry. That's one of the big red flags that I'd look for if I was an interviewer of like, if you give me a Rails app that you built and you just scaffolded it, like if I still feel like you're worth my time, then that time is going to be mostly spent just haranguing you on like, what is is this for? What is this doing? What is this doing? Because if you didn't type it, I'm assuming you don't know how to type it, right? And so I want to make sure that I have the practice typing all the stuff in. So, you know, maybe the scaffold was a little too much. What if I said Rails D scaffold taste testers? Or tester, yeah. Oh, okay, that's gone.
Does that drop?
Yeah, I don't think it dropped the database, but we no longer have a route for it. Pardon?
When you say Rails D.
Oh, D was, yeah, to delete, or yeah, or to destroy, I think, is the shorthand. But yeah, G is generate, and then D is delete. So yeah, scaffolding is a thing. I'm glad I forgot almost to show that. But yeah, the scaffold is beautiful.
But kept the taste testers.
So yeah, do I still have a table in my database? Let's see. Rails C for console. Uninitialized constant. So if it's in the database, I'd have to maybe check the schema to be sure, right? Because I can't just like go in and ask. Let's see. Yeah, I still have that. What's interesting though is that when I deleted the scaffolds, I deleted the migration, right? So now I have a forward run migration from something called taste testers that I no longer have access to. So how am I supposed to get back? Like, what am I supposed to do here? I have to drop my database, honestly. I can't like roll back, or I could recreate the scaffold, like use that exact same scaffold to roll back the migration one step and then delete the scaffold. But the problem here is like I can't say like rake db rollback because it can't roll back that last migration. At least, I don't know, can it? No migration with that version number. So it tracks that migration's version number. Even if I wanted to recreate that migration so I could roll it back manually, I'd have to update the timestamp on the migration file name with this exact value because that's what Active Record is looking for. And maybe I just need to use my alias to drop the database. Oh no, my YODO command isn't found. Maybe I've had this one open for too long. Source, CSH, profile, but it's prepended with a dot. See if I have it now.
When you delete the scaffold like you just did, can you like do skip just like you can when you're generating something?
I'm not sure. I've honestly never tried it. I just don't play around with scaffold that much. Scaffold is a nice curiosity. It's nice to do a scaffold and like see some like boilerplate ways that things get set up. Let me do another one real quick. I'm gonna bring that back. So if I do this G scaffold one more time, yeah, I don't know that I would try to do a D and then like skip stuff that like I'd worked in. Generally, if I'm gonna use a scaffold, it's probably to test something else besides the scaffold. Like if I care enough about code to ship it, I'm really gonna like handcraft it. So maybe I care about like how Google Maps works with an app, but I don't care about the app itself. So I just scaffold something about pizza and then I use Google Maps and see if like I can integrate that and maybe find a pizza place in the app. But I just used scaffold to get something up off the ground so I could have some pages to play in. So if we take a look at like what this actually generated for us, it did make a migration according to what I gave it. Everything after the word taste tester was being read as an attribute. So when I said name, it assumed string, that's the default. And then I said age : integer to specify that age would be an integer for the taste tester. It automatically put timestamps up for me. In the app models folder, we got a taste tester class, right? In the controllers, we ended up with a taste testers controller, not just with the 7 controller actions, but with everything to handle object creation. Rails has a pattern called strong parameters. Sam, you were asking about this earlier this week, about how do we make sure that like only an allowed list of attributes is used to create an object. Rails params like requires a subhash called taste tester, and then within that subhash will only let through values with the keys name and age. So that's what's used to create the taste tester objects. And you're gonna learn more about this at the tail end of labs that we've pushed out for you this weekend. But yeah, then I've got all of the kind of conventional actions. Notice that they know how to respond in HTML and they also know how to respond in JSON. So when you say format HTML, you can pass that a block and tell it what to do. If the extension ends in .html, generally that's the default too. But if I add .json to the end of a URL in the taste testers subdomain, it's just gonna give me back a JSON object representing that, which I think is kind of slick. Hang on a second, rake, let me go back. Where did I have my migrate? That'll get our some migrations back the way that we had them. Cool. So we have those two things, and then if I'm in my app and I go over here and I make one again, then I'd have one in my database. So new taste tester, sure it'll be me again. Fantastic. Cool. And then I go, this is taste testers 1. I think if I hit 1.json, it'll serve me JSON. Yeah, look at that. So like this is also a JSON API now, the way that it's been written. If I go to the page on a certain device that like knows how to render HTML, that'll work. If I have some other thing like a front end app, it can specify .json when it makes its requests, and it won't get HTML back. It'll just get a JSON object. Therefore, this app, this backend, this controller could serve a desktop app, and it could serve a mobile React app or an Angular app, right? It could serve like your refrigerator some information if your refrigerator had an internet connection and knew how to make requests to this given endpoint. Yeah, so Rails does a lot of stuff, right? I think that fundamentally what we're going to start thinking about is how that routes.rb file needs, our thinking needs to change from the Sinatra way of doing things, where we just had the whole URL and the method all next to each other with the work to be done. Now we define the routes in very terse ways, right? Or even if we're being less terse, we still have the URL and method over here pointing to another method. And then we have a method and a controller where the thing actually gets done. So that's going to be probably the biggest thing to wrap your mind around this weekend, is just a different way to think about how you can get into your own app and how you can use these tasks in the terminal to like get your bearings around the application. What other questions do we have? Matt?
So if running scaffold creates all the files, and you can still edit those files, is it just bad practice to use it and then edit it how you need it? Does it take longer?
Oftentimes, yeah, because if you're building a certain app, it's very, very unlikely that like the default CSS or the default like even HTML structure is going to be exactly the way that you'd like to write your views. So the scaffold, I think, is helpful for making sure that like, I think it's most helpful on the controller side because it sets up like really default, really conventional ways for controller methods to work in Rails. You can see like this index sets taste testers to taste tester.all, just like what we did for desserts, right? Show doesn't seem to be finding an individual taste tester. That's because there's a before action called set taste tester that's running on show, edit, update, and destroy. You'll notice what those 4 routes have in common is that they all contain the taste tester ID in the URL, right? They're about one thing. And so we have this method set taste tester down here in the private space so that nothing outside of this controller can call this method. It's just to help the controller do its own work. And then we just set an instance variable for taste tester by doing a find on params.id, right? So this is all very conventional setup stuff, and that's helpful. But when I get into my views, like I'm gonna have my own needs. I'm probably coming in with my own wireframe. A lot of times I don't need to make all 7 routes for a resource too. Like that's a really important thing to consider, that like I never need to edit or update tweets. So if I was gonna make a tweet app, I probably would not wanna just start with a scaffold because I'd want to skip a couple of those resources. And I think that once you're fast enough with Rails and comfortable enough with Rails, it's more irritating to look through files that you didn't create that got put there and make decisions about whether or not to keep them than it is to start from zero and then to build up from there according to what you know needs to be built. I think it's always more efficient to just make something rather than take something and then decide what pieces of it you'd like to keep. Once you get past a certain comfort point. And this is that same fear versus boredom thing, right? Like when you get bored of writing all this stuff, I think there's a point at that the trade-offs change. The pros and cons of using a scaffold shift, but now the cons of using a scaffold are pretty grave because you'd run the risk of not actually learning the things that you need to learn about how to build this stuff by hand. So that's the main reason I say avoid generators like scaffold. I think migration generator's fine. I think Rails G model definitely on the table. I think that G controller is fine, right? You get a controller file set up, but I think that scaffold is probably a bridge too far. There's also this word Rails G resource, which does kind of model and controller and migration. And I don't remember, does it do views too? I think it sets up some basic REST views, if I remember correctly. But yeah, I generally keep it to just model, migration, scaffold. Model, migration, and controller. Those are the generators that I would stick with. Other questions?
Actually, a second.
Yeah.
Wondering how smart Rails is. When you created the migration, you felt it like creating desserts. If you did like add ingredients to desserts, will it interpret that correctly?
How about this? I'm gonna see if this works. No, okay. It's worth a shot. Sometimes it would see that this is like an alter column thing that I'm trying to do, I thought that if I named the first thing, if I said change column that I have to another column on whatever table, that it would give me like some boilerplate setup within change for that. There are other ones in Rails that will shorthand. I don't remember which ones they are off the top of my head. If I wanted to look, I might say something like Rails migration generator syntax automatically add method to file. I don't know, something like that.
You need to update that.
Maybe. Let me see. I think under migrations, there's actually some other examples of, let's see, add part number didn't give us one. Oh, that might do it. So let's try this. Rails G migration. And then we give it a class name and then give it the column that we think about and the type of column. So we could say like add add favorite food to taste testers. And then I said like favorite food. Food is a string. I wonder if that'll catch. Huzzah! Add column, taste testers, favorite food, string. So yeah, there's some conventions that are set up in this way, and yeah, I think that Nick's right in terms of like using like words like update if you want to change existing columns. So like, I'm not sure, I don't want to play around with the syntax up here. I think it's much more useful if you get in and practice looking at this part of the Rails guide yourself and practice applying it to your own migration stuff. Because here's the other thing I need to tell you, like, you're all web developers now, like, and you have been all week because you've spent the whole week developing the web. And I'm not fussing around when I say that. Like, it's important for you to recognize that the difference between you and somebody who's working as a junior right now at like the nerdery is just a difference of like quantity of hours that you've put in so far and not necessarily quality of who you are as a person, right? Like the time and effort that you put in on Rails going forward, not just while you're here, but after you graduate, is going to affect like your career prospects and stuff. So you're already this thing that you want to be. And like now is a great weekend to be intentional about how you'd like to act on that. So like how would you spend your weekend as a web developer? Now is a good time to start playing around with that, right? Oh yeah, I'd check up on the documentation to make sure I knew what like my common tools were doing, and maybe I'd try to read an article or two about Rails and try to understand what it's about. But it's about staying on our work, right? And it's about developing slowly over time and getting used to this spot. So I think the best thing to do is to keep those Rails guides really handy and to start relying more and more on getting the information that you need out of that set of documentation, because the better that you've read and understood that documentation, the easier it's going to be for you to remember where to go back and like reread something, right? You're never gonna have to memorize all of this stuff, but you are expected to be a really good librarian through all of the resources and processes and debugging strategies that help Rails developers be successful. And I think the first most important resource for you right now is these Rails guides that have sections for everything, migrations and associations, and this is just all model stuff, right? And then in views, there's a whole section about like how to do forms. There's another whole section, layouts and rendering. Like this all talks about how we can do more stuff with those link helpers, right? Hey, if we have a chunk of reusable code, could we maybe like have a partial page that we just insert by naming it a certain way? We can. It talks about that in there too. And then this talks about controllers, it talks about routing, and then we've got other stuff in like digging deeper. But over this weekend, I think it's probably good to skim at least a couple of the chapters in here, but if you're gonna do a deep dive anywhere, I'd do a deep dive in getting started, because I think you'll realize just by reading that like, oh, a human wrote this, not like a robot. This wasn't like scraped from somebody's like comments that they wrote into code. This was written by somebody expecting that real people would be reading it, taking feedback from people who have read it, trying to make it as readable and friendly as possible to like get you involved in this. And so like part of being a web developer is like you don't really need me to tell you how to do every single thing anymore. And over the course of the next few weeks, I'll be like pulling back more and more and putting more things in your hands in terms of like, oh yeah, try researching that. Or hey, look that up in the guides and see if you can implement it. Because I think at this point, like you've got the capability and I want to start testing that a little bit. So if you have a question for me about, hey, this link isn't working, I might send you like a link to a specific part of some documentation that I think is related to the misstep in your code. And then I want to see if you can use that resource to put that last step together. And I'm still here to help if you're stuck at that point. But I really want to help you get the tools that you need so that when you're working on your own time, you can be the source of your own best questions and answers as much as anybody else can. And I think with Rails, because it's so conventional and because the conventions are so well laid out and documented, it's actually never been easier to find your footing when you feel like you've lost it. Cool. Other questions? Sweet. Let's do some Rails.